Okay, it looks like we've had a couple more attendees join us already, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Again, our speakers for today are going to be Chris Robertson from ERA Technologies, Douglas Leach from the Chemical Business Association, and Rob Pickin from SiliconExpert Technologies, going over REACH, its current state in the industry, and its impact on the electronics industry. As just a quick to-do, talking about how you ask questions, how they're going to be addressed after the webinar, and the fact that you will be receiving the slides after the webinar, please use this question log so that you can chat with us. During the webinar, you're muted, so it's easiest for you if you can send us these questions. And again, anything we don't follow up with by the end of the webinar, we'll follow up with individually. And finally, there is a survey at the end of the webinar. We ask that you give us some feedback. We do listen, and we're constantly trying to make ourselves better. This is our agenda for the webinar. Rob Pickin's going to go over a quick introduction about who we are and how we relate to the industry. Douglas Leach will then start talking about the state of play within REACH so far, who will then pass the screen on to Chris Robertson, who will be talking about the key issues within the engineering sector. And finally, Rob Pickin will talk again about SiliconExpert and how we do deal with REACH and cover it in our database. And finally, we will do some questions and answers at the very end. And again, anything we don't get to, we will reply to you via email following the webinar. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass the screen to Rob Pickin.
Thanks very much, Amanda, and thank you for the introduction there. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on our web seminar for REACH, Future and Impact on the Industry. As Amanda mentioned, my name is Rob Pickin. I'm the Director of Sales here in Europe, Middle East and Africa for SiliconExpert, and I'll be giving you a brief introduction as to who SiliconExpert are and what we do, and why we believe we're in a position to host a webinar such as this to bring information to the industry more widely. SiliconExpert was founded in the year 2000 and is headquartered in Santa Clara in California. Currently, we serve hundreds of electronic original equipment manufacturers, distributors, manufacturers, and contract manufacturers, CEM, EMS. Our electronics database contains over 300 million components in hundreds of data categories from over 15,000 manufacturers. We present this information to the marketplace with our comprehensive software tools accessed online, which I will show to you later on and talk through the detail of REACH, obsolescence, and other information. We also provide integrated solutions to provide data directly into customer databases and services, as well as professional services to carry out one-of-a-kind scrubs and one-of-a-kind management data information services for our customer base. The database contains millions of components in various categories. These are just a few of them, and it enables you to do various different aspects of the management work which you would do today in a much more automated fashion. For example, the receipt of PCMs, the management of entire bills of materials, and the mitigation of risks across the industry, from counterfeit to obsolescence to availability to second sourcing to environmental risks, which of course is our focus today with the REACH web seminar. With that short overview, I'm going to pass over to Douglas. Sorry, I'm not. I'm going to talk a little bit about the component database we have here. The real thing about SiliconExpert that you will notice is the domain expertise that we have. We're completely focused on electronics and electromechanical components, and we do not have any other areas of focus. Therefore, all of our information work and our data team are focused completely on the electronics database and the management of data around the components that you require. One of our strongest areas is environmental and compliance data, and the REACH information that we have is continually up to date as part of our data team's daily efforts. I'm now going to pass on to Douglas and to look at where REACH is today, and Douglas is from the Chemical Business Association. So without further ado, Douglas, I'm going to pass over the information to yourself.
Right, just let me get set up for 2 seconds and I will put myself onto, he says, he hopes. There you go. Right, as said before, my name is Doug Leach. I'm the Technical Director of the Chemical Business Association in the UK, and I'm going to talk to you about the state of play so far, where REACH is, where it's gone, and how it's got there. He says, if the slides will work. Right, the next slide indicates the registration update so far. This number in the bottom in red is since around about March last year. So what that indicates is that the total number of registrations is steadily moving in a 6-month period and is also steadily adding additional unique substances to the ECHA database with regards to registered substances. As you can see, we're now just short of 8,000 substances, sort of 7,800-ish materials, unique substances that have been registered. This does not include substances that have also been newly registered as new substances. This is the older substances that have been registered. When you get your slides, there's 2 slides that you will see in between the ones that I've just done, which are just some more about the actual types of registrations and the numbers of companies and sizes of companies that have actually done registrations. I haven't put them on here because it's just basic data. This gives you an idea of the top 10 substances that have been registered under REACH. And as you can see, ethanol, a very big registration, ethylene oxide, methyl oxyuran, which is propylene oxide, and then you have some other materials. As you can imagine, iron is a fairly big consortium, aluminium is a fairly big consortium, where people may be talking about various different aspects in articles and stuff like that. But that gives you a rough idea of the top 10 types of substances that have been registered. The outlook for 2018 is that REACH originally said there was going to be around about 30,000 substances in the phase-in process. Take off the 7 and a bit, so approximately 8. What that means is we've got about a 22,000 substance gap at the moment. I put down there a slight gap. It depends who you talk to, but some people are very worried that the 2018 deadline has got a lot to live up to, and that there's a lot of substances that are either going to go missing, or the small to medium-sized enterprises in Europe and outside Europe are going to come charging over the hill like the cavalry and actually save the day. It depends on how optimistic you want to be to which one you actually believe. So with that in mind, June this year, the European Commission issued a roadmap, and they're already starting to put new logos onto the website and click-throughs and extra pages on to give people as much information as possible with regard to the whole process. They are aware that there is a lack of awareness across the board, not just in the chemical industry. The downstream user industry has a lack of awareness of REACH, and so part of it is trying to see how we can raise awareness, or how the Commission and the Member States can raise awareness towards REACH. One of the other ones is how they can identify co-registrants. The co-registrants, when they're doing registrations, some of these companies, some of these products have not been registered yet. So the difficulty is trying to find out who to actually talk to. Then you've got cooperating when you're in there. Then there's worries about actually collation of data. Are these companies that are all SMEs actually going to have enough data to be able to do a registration? And then how can submitting the registration be made easier? Because at the moment it's on an IT system, but there's a lot of complaints that the IT system is very, very complex, complicated, and you need a degree in chemistry and IT to understand what to do with it. In that vein, there's been a lot of problems with, or a lot of issues raised about data sharing. and there has been a number of data sharing disputes, but as you can see there, as of end of August this year, so approximately 2 months ago, there'd only been a total of 25 actually raised on data sharing disputes. This is where people are doing joint registrations and people don't like the costs or don't like the process that's gone on with regard to the actual registration dossier. Only 25, one of which was inadmissible because actually the company raised the data sharing dispute but was talking about the wrong substance. So of the 24 left, you can see that 9 have been found for the plaintiff and 15 against. So it's, the data sharing dispute is shown that of the ones that have been raised at the moment, most are in the case where they're against the plaintiff and the people who are raising the data sharing dispute is not correct in what they're actually saying. But this slide here gives you the breakdown of actually the causes that ECHA have used when they voted for or found in favour of the plaintiff. You have things like lack of a cost breakdown, lack of a cost sharing mechanism, or a lack of explanation of costs. And this is one of the things that a lot of people have been complaining about in REACH, that it costs a lot of money to get a registration done and to buy what's called a letter of access to get your registration done. Failure to reply, failure to communicate timely. The regulation indicates that everything should be done in a timely manner, and if companies or CIFs or the consortium that are holding all the data do not communicate back, do not reply, some people have been given access to the data because they haven't got any information back. Then you've got price, not independent of tonnage band. REACH says you should only pay for the registration cost for the tonnage band you're in, whereas some people have been just saying it's a flat fee and here you go, this is what you pay regardless of which tonnage band you're in. Also unjustified annual increase, so access to our data will go up by 5–10% each year regardless of whether there's anything actually done or not. And then some unilateral approaches where some people have said, this is it, this is what we're doing, and if you don't like it, don't register. So these are the sort of variations that people have found. So what the Commission is discussing at the moment is what's called an implementing act, and it will be the first implementing act to be issued against REACH. The DG Environment and DG Enterprise, so that's the ministries in Europe that's responsible for industry and the environment, had a workshop at the end of December last year, and there was a lot of comments about data sharing and various other aspects. The idea is that this implementing act will actually put more action, more things into law that will allow CIFs, Substance Information Exchange Fora, that are handling data exchange to actually communicate better and put a lot more things in the public domain so that they can actually be controlled. And one of the things they're talking about is at the moment REACH only says that you will have access to vertebrate animal data, and that's it if a data dispute is found in your favour. What we're hearing about this implementing act is it would be the full dossier. So if you were proved to be falling foul of the rules for data sharing, then you would lose access to all the data, and if it was found in your favour, you would gain access and be able to register your substances. The idea is they're looking to try and see whether they can maybe balance the process out and stop people trying to be a bit too bossy, etc. within CIFs. The Directors Contact Group is still going. It started off before the 2010 registration deadline as a task and finish group. It then got its remit extended for 2013. It's now had its remit extended until the end of 2018, and it's going to be doing a little bit more work with regard to SMEs, because that seems to be where most of the aspects and problems are, because ECHA admit that most of the people that are in this area are down as SMEs that have done pre-registration. So it's going to be an area where a lot of people are involved. And there's a web link up there too where you can get the information from the Directors Contact Group to help you understand what's going on. The candidate list, as you can imagine, is one of the main areas that electronic companies need to keep an eye on, because the candidate list brings in a lot of roles and responsibilities once it hits that list, and I think Chris will talk about that slightly later on. So far, we have, as of June this year, we have 155 substances on the candidate list, and it's likely to go up again at around about December this year. These were the last 4 substances that were added to the candidate list, and primarily with the candidate list there seems to be a push for heavy metals, so cadmium is one. Then you have the other one is phthalates, which tends to get pushed onto the list. And then you end up with the odd 1 or 2 other substances. The borates are going onto this list because they have reprotoxic issues to them, and so they seem to be putting a lot more borates forward to go onto the candidate list. There was and has been a couple of appeals about the candidate listings, and this one, pitch, coal tar, high temperature, was added to the SVHC, the candidate list, as persistent bioaccumulative and toxic, so very environmentally hazardous. The group of companies then took it to the General Court in Europe to appeal because they weren't happy with it being added. They said it was flawed methodology, etc., and shouldn't have been added. The General Court found in favour of the European Commission. So they then took it to the European Court of Justice, the ECJ, who then dismissed the appeal and said it was manifestly unfounded, the comments that the industry was making. And ECHA does have discretion in the assessment of complex scientific and technical facts, and didn't overstep their mark. You know, they did it by the book, they did it right, and the General Court and the European Court of Justice can only work on the technical process, how it works, not the actual answer, not the scientific background that comes out. They can only look to see if due process was undertaken, and they've decided that due process was undertaken, and so now CTPHT is still and will remain on the candidate list and eventually go on to authorization in the future. And bearing that in mind, there's now 31 substances actually on Annex 14, which is the authorization annex. And as you can see, 9 were added in August of this year. There was supposed to be 10, but a product called DMAC, and I'll put something later on to explain what that is after the event, because I've just realized I'm talking acronyms. But that's been postponed because there's some discussions with regard to exactly whether or not it should have been on there in the first place. The 5th recommendation of adding something to the annex was finished and proposed to the Commission in February of this year, and that contained 5 substances on it. And these were the 5 substances. So as you can see, you've got zirconia, refractory ceramic fibers, you've got alumosilicate refractory fibers, and then you've got some other materials that were put on there, like for instance dimethylformamide. There's some issues about dimethylformamide because it's used as an intermediate or a solvent in pharmaceutical industry, and so it going on the authorization list can cause some problems for them. And ADCA, the next one down, the dicarboxamide, that one's got some problems because of the way that it was handled in the registration process was a little bit gung-ho and belt and braces, and it's come back to cause some problems that it's now on there. But there's a big fight to try and remove them 2 off there, and until sometime next year we won't know whether that's positive or not. But there's already been the 6th recommendation published, and this was published in September of this year, and it's the largest to date. They've suggested 22 substances to go onto the candidate list. So if you look back, as I said earlier, we have 31 on at the moment. They're now talking that this will increase it to 53 if all of these substances go through. These substances are all under consultation at the moment, and the closing date for response and information and feedback, etc., is November the 30th. So that's the link to the actual recommendations for inclusion that you can go to. But here's the first group of substances. So what I would do is, when you get the slides later on, have a look down them and see whether there's any substances that you have. As you can see, again, you have borates on there. You have phthalates, as I mentioned earlier, on there. The one that is a little bit of an issue is the N-propyl bromide, the 1-bromopropane. It is a solvent that's being promoted in sort of various industries to replace the likes of trichloroethylene or various others to be used in vapor degreasing baths and things like that. That is now being put forward to be on authorization list because it has a reprotoxic classification to it. And as you can see, there's 2 phthalates on there. Then you go through, and here's the rest of the substances. So again, more borates, lead salts, sort of orange lead, lead, antimony lead, yellow, boric acid, more phthalates. So you start to get a picture of the types of substances that are going to end up in the authorization. They're all substances where they have known carcinogenic, mutagenic, or reprotoxic effects. These are all the applications that have been put forward or in the process, in the pipeline, to actually get an authorization. As I've said earlier on various different presentations, authorization is very much, once it's on the list, it's gone, and that's it. You can't use it unless you have an authorization. And as you can see, there's a large list of substances. There's 176 indications that they were going to notify. This has actually only appeared in 15 applications. So it's having the effect that the Commission wanted, which was to get rid of substances of high concern. There's currently an application in for trichloroethylene and diarsenic trioxide. Trichloroethylene, there's possibly another one coming in about using it in vapor degreasing in closed systems, but we haven't seen that as yet. At the moment, it's a Dutch company looking at doing solvent removal of, on recovery of resins and things from various different processes. But these are the ones that are ongoing. The European Commission has given its first authorization. So Rolls-Royce PLC, 7th of August, they've got 8 years to use a phthalate, and that's the sort of REACH registration, the REACH number that the case got the first authorization. As I said, they have to review it by 2022, and they'd have to start that work something like 18 months beforehand to do the review. So actually it's only got about 6.5 years before they've got to start the work again. Part of the reason why they got this was because they already have a substitution plan in place that they're working on to find substitutes, but if they can't use this specific phthalate, then they would have serious problems making engines, so that's why ultimately the authorization was given. Restriction's still there. It's still there in the background. Restriction is a more targeted tool than authorization. Authorization is like a big club, a cudgel. It says you cannot use this material unless you have an authorization application submitted and approved. With regard to restriction, it's very much a case of you can continue using this material except for this, this and this. And it is very worth keeping your eyes on the restriction area, because this is part of the enforcement action that's happening in the UK especially, and other European nations as well, where they are keeping checks on the REACH restriction annex, which is Annex 17, and the substances that are on there. And what they're then doing is they're making sure that companies are not buying materials with it in. And there has been a few instances where companies have had issues and been taken to task because of products that they're importing in from China, India, America, South America, that still contains some of these materials that are on the restriction list and shouldn't be. And so, there has been a few European companies that have had action taken against them because of the fact that they're still buying material, and they should be keeping an eye on it. So it's worth keeping an eye on the restriction area. And these are the sort of the latest restrictions that are on at the moment. You have, it sounds peculiar, but one of them is barbecue lighting fluid and oils that are used in decorative lamps that you put onto your patio table and light, and it gives light, it gives a little bit of heat off and things like that. The problem is that they have what's called R65 in the old CLP system, or H304 in the new CLP GHS process, which is harmful, may cause lung damage if swallowed. And the idea is that it gets into your stomach, it vaporizes, and you get a heavy concentration of vapor in your stomach, in your lungs, and it causes problems. So that's under there, but that's primarily in the consumer market. But as you can see, you've got siloxanes in there. You've also got perfluorooctanoic acid, so PFOA, along with some of the salts. And again, you've got dimethylformamide in there, where they're trying to control that, and part of it is have it as a byproduct left in parts when it comes back. So restriction is, it's harder to get than authorization. You need to go through a lot more hurdles to get there. But once member states do this, they actually get a more targeted approach. So that finishes what I would classify as my sort of general run through. As I said, that gives you an idea of where REACH has gone so far, where some of the new points that are coming in could have some effect, could cause some issues for people. And so what I'll do now is I'll hand over to Chris, and Chris should be able to take you further on with regards to various other parts. Thank you, and I'll speak later on.
Thank you, Doug. I'm just navigating my way to show you my screen. Okay, can you see my slides? So, okay, Rob. So you run it for me, and I'll talk to the slides.
Is this showing properly? It's compiled fully for everyone to see on the screen?
Yep, that looks much better. Thank you, Rob.
Fantastic.
Okay. Right. Just let me sort my screen out as well. Okay. So on slide 3, please, Rob. Okay. So slide 3. First of all, let's talk a bit about where REACH has come from and where it's going in terms of substances of very high concern. So SVHCs, substances of very high concern, started off around about 2008 with a handful of them, and now, as Doug mentioned, we're up to 155. And you can see these little stacks show the progress of SVHCs towards the European Commission's stated target of 578 by 2020. And in each of the stacks, you can see that there's a little red bar at the bottom, which is the SVHCs which have been which are on Annex 14 so far. The ones which are proposed, that's the sort of 22 that Doug mentioned, in the darker orange. The medium orange is SVHCs which aren't yet on Annex 14, because bear in mind that the SVHCs is something called the candidate list, which are candidates for going on to Annex 14. That's what the candidate means. Then there's a few SVHCs which are intended to be put forward to become SVHCs, a few substances which are not yet SVHCs but are on their way. And then there's the blue bars is, if you like, the shortfall between what ECHA's target is and where they got to so far. There was a big rush, as you can see, in 2012, and there was a big jump from the previous year of, I think, 55 substances were added. But since then, the process has slowed down again, and it's going to be interesting to see whether what the rate is going to pick up again. It doesn't, at the moment, look like it looks like they're going to be lagging. There's been a lot of criticism of the prioritization process, and I'll be talking about that anon. Okay, Doug, sorry, not Doug, Rob, let's have the next slide, shall we? Okay. So, in terms of the new SVHCs, Doug mentioned that we have another 4 added in June, and in fact there are another 13 added the previous year. As you saw, the number which were added were somewhat lower. Next forward, please. The question for engineering companies is, are they actually used in hardware? Are they actually used in articles? We keep a sort of internal database of uses of substances and preparations in articles, and the following pie chart gives you an idea of, thank you, our overall analysis, that roughly half of them are used in hardware products in some way. Some of those uses are quite niche, like possibly a contrast agent, for example. I think in MRI is one application. Very, very niche. Some in sensors where they tend to be quite small as well. But even so, once talking about 70-ish substances are used in articles. So it's a significant issue for any company. If you have a legal obligation to provide information on SVHCs in articles when you provide them to a recipient, there's an awful lot of information there to suggest that SVHCs are ubiquitous. They're everywhere. Okay, next slide.
Chris, and also very quickly, we're getting a couple of questions coming in asking that you can if you could turn the volume up on your phone line.
Okay, is that better?
That sounds perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, everyone. I want you to, it's best to be heard. Doug mentioned the recommendations for going forward to Annex 14 of the 22, and this is just a very general overview of their uses. You can see that we've got an awful lot of phthalates now used in which are now have made it onto Annex 14, and this is a big obsolescence issue for companies. You move from one plasticizer to another, but then discover that that one's going to be subject to some sort of regulatory measure. So that's a problem. Lead compounds have also been a big target, and many of them have been restricted for many years as well. But you can see here a number of uses that lead compounds are used in this particular. These particular 7 are used across a range of applications, from stabilizers in polymers through to uses in glass, which of course is much more niche. The boron-based compounds Doug mentioned, but some of those are used in electroplating, and some of them used as flame retardants as well. So they're possible alternatives to other substances which are under regulatory pressure. Sometimes they're used in processes. The anthracene correlated substances Doug's already mentioned, used in not too many applications, but still in printed circuit board, printed wired board processing. Reportedly it's used, and also in some heavy duty sealants as well. And propyl bromide, Doug's mentioned the problems with that, and also for non-phenol compounds, branched and linear is a big long definition, which there's a hyperlink at the bottom. of the page, which you'll be able to click on to take you through to the full list. And that's used as a wetting agent in some processes. So quite an extensive range. We get the impression that the intention isn't necessarily to go forward with all 22, but of course that really depends on how substantive the comments are on those substances. If there are no substantive contents, then there probably is no good reason why they shouldn't be taken forward. Next slide, please. So the SVHC roadmap. This was published back in December of last year, and the idea behind this is next, please. Is this to include all relevant currently known SVHCs on the candidate list by 2020. So that's 578 or so. But it does say it should exclude substances better dealt with through restriction. It's interesting actually that this restriction measure is a much more rapier-like measure than Annex 14, as Doug mentioned, and it is also a much fairer measure in many ways because it also applies equally to whether you're manufacturing in EU or outside of the EU, which Annex 14 doesn't have that effect. Okay, next. There's two elements to the SVHC roadmap process. One is a sort of an overall screening, and then is looking at what options are best to go forward with. Next. And one of the reasons this has been brought out is to give more visibility, so that there have been complaints that we don't really know what's coming up on the list of on the candidate list. Next, we don't know what's going to be proposed. Please give us more visibility as we drive down the road as to what is going to be happening next. Something called the Activities Coordination Tool was a tool available to the authorities, a database available to the authorities, and the P Activities Coordination Tool, Public Activities Coordination Tool, is the means of us in the outside world, if you like, outside of the authorities, seeing what is happening. And fortunately, that was published just very recently, so we can say a little bit about what's on that list. Thank you. Next, yeah. Okay, so this on the right is the process. We don't need to go through that in any detail, but just to give you an idea of that the process that underlies the SVHC roadmap process. And this was launched, as I said, very recently in September. And so far, some 50 substances or so have been input into the process. Next, please. So, oh, sorry, 80 substances have gone into the process. And in terms of substances coming out at the end of the process, we've got 5 for which it's been decided there's no action needed at the moment, at least. 4 where another regulatory approach would be more appropriate. 5 where the suggestion is they should be looked at for addition to the candidate list of SVHCs. 11 going forward for restriction, and 56, that's where the 50 was in my mind, where it's on hold at the moment, or they're still working on their work on that substance before they come to a final decision. So this is very useful to industry because it gives you an idea of what might be coming next. Let's talk a little bit about each of those green boxes, if you like. Next. So suggestions for restriction, the 11. Well, there's a whole bunch of those. All 11 of them are diisocyanates, and this is their abbreviated names. You can look them up in the SVHC roadmap yourself. But I would have filled the whole slide if I'd put them all in, so I haven't. They're looking at those with a view to restriction. They're used in quite a lot of applications, things like paints and coatings and adhesives and sealants, elastomers of various sorts. Main use, though, is making is in production of rigid polyurethane foams. So these could be found in many places. However, it's not entirely clear that they will go for restriction. They're keeping Annex 14 for the authorization to carry on using it approach as a backup, and they remains to be seen which route they're going to take. This really only covers use in the industrial and professional context, they say they'll come back to this when we look at consumer uses. Next. Then we have these two substances, DOTE and MOTE together. DOTE's again a very long substance name: 2-ethyl hexyl 10-ethyl 4,4-dioctyl 7-oxo 8-oxo 3,5-diethyl 4-stanate tetradicanoate. I won't say that again. These substances are used as stabilizers in PVC, and some of them have been actually approved for use in food contact applications. Already restricted by REACH from supply to the general public, and in articles intended to come into contact with the skin. The intention is that they're going to go forward with restriction for these applications. Yeah. The Annex 15 dossier for this compound was submitted in August. Okay, next. Then we're talking about other SVHCs. These are the, I think 5, weren't there, I said. So we've got 2 cadmium compounds. Cadmium, which is used, cadmium fluoride used to make alloys, and cadmium sulfate used in electroplating to make cadmium coatings. And as you're probably aware, cadmium is already restricted in many applications already, including in ROS, for example, except for high safety critical applications where you are still allowed to use it under REACH Annex 17. So these are proposed to become SVHCs as well. And then moving on, we have lead compounds. Again, these are heavily regulated already, and ROS regulates, restricts lead, and very specific lead compounds are already restricted, or SVHCs. There are concerns about the use of lead in pipework, and this measure is very much considering that issue. Migration from metals when in contact with food as well, and occupational exposure too. So yeah, that's where the other measures come in, which I think I will come on to subsequently. So they're looking at restricting or putting in place occupational exposure levels for lead in drinking water. Okay, moving on. And I think the final SVHCs suggested, acrylonitrile, mercury compounds, and nitric acid. Acrylonitrile is a monomer for making various plastics like ABS and to make carbon fiber synthetic rubbers. They're thinking of introducing a uniform EU-wide occupational exposure level, OEL, which was previously proposed in 2004, a limit of 2 ppm, and they want to, they suggest that is actually taken forward. Mercury compounds, that's much wider sort of consideration there. They're suggesting promotion of its use in LED lighting. They just put that in on our street, which is rather nice, and improved waste collection. And apart from that, I think they are sort of holding fire to see what happens with respect to the Minamata Convention, which targets mining and emissions, and see what other measures may need to be put in place subsequently once they see how effective that is. And nitric acid, widely used process chemical, of course, restricted to supply to the general public already, as you can use it to make explosives. And but it's registrations for other uses, for consumer uses. They found that no uses were really above trace levels, so they don't really see that taking further action at the moment is appropriate, apart from changing the classification to include acute toxic by acute inhalation. Sorry, acutely toxic by inhalation, if I can put my words in the right order. So you can see that it isn't obvious that once a substance goes in the front end of the roadmap process, it's necessarily going to be dealt with by REACH. It may take other routes. Next, please, Rob. And because, in fact, some substances have been evaluated, and these 5 are not proposed to be taken forward through REACH at the moment anyway. Copper 2 sulfate used in animal feeds and therefore eventually ends up as fertilizer. And there's actions or research that's been done by a few standards agencies at the moment. Until that's finished, they're not going to do any more, but they might. HDDGE is used in epoxy systems, and but there aren't significant uses discovered by Denmark to do a study into this, so they're not proposing to take that forward. Na3NTA, trisodium nitrile triacetate, reportedly used in industrial and domestic cleaning applications, but the use has declined significantly. So again, it seems that further regulatory measures aren't necessary to force it off the market. PTBBA have previously been proposed for authorization, but this is no longer considered necessary, as all the reported uses are as intermediates, so which doesn't affect Annex 14. And DTBQ, 2,5-dibutyl hydroquinone, has previously been used in cosmetics, paints, food contact materials, and there was concerns about use in drinking water tanks. But again, usage seems to be too low to merit further action. So, and in fact, it's not registered yet under REACH, which suggests a very low tonnage. So, interesting that the process, any process that has a sort of barrier in terms of passing or failing, needs to have some which either pass or fail to show that it's effective. So this would tend to indicate that there's some measure of objectivity about the process, which is encouraging. Okay, in terms of next slide, proposed SVHCs. These are the ones which are the uses of proposed SVHCs coming up. We've got 4 plasticizers. Those 4 at the top are ones which are also proposed to be added to ROS. Cadmium fluoride, cadmium sulfate, already mentioned. Those 2 UV stabilizers are added to plastics to stop them degrading. And again, I've mentioned those 2 DOT and MOT substances. So these are the substances which have come out the end of the roadmap process and are already on their way to being becoming SVHCs, unless somebody suggests good evidence otherwise during the present consultation period. Okay. Next slide. So almost lastly, spare parts. It's an interesting area, this, because there is no repair as produce principle under REACH. For those of you who are familiar with ROS, you'll know that an exemption, for example, applies for you to carry on maintaining, upgrading spare parts for a product which went on the market before a particular deadline. When that exemption did apply, if the exemption lapses, you can still carry on maintaining that piece of equipment. You can't do that under REACH. There's no such thing. And therefore, there's a lot of discussion going on between the authorities and major companies, trade associations, as to how to go about doing this. And there's no firm conclusions being come to as to a sensible approach to this. So it's something to be aware of, that there could be significant issues in carrying on using spare parts in products, which the spare part might have been made many years ago. You may have an obligation to maintain it for 10, 20, 30 years, particularly true of things like the rail sector, for example. But how do you do that if you can't actually, if the parts contains a restricted substance which has since come in? All this is really saying that there's an awful lot of pressure on obsolescence for any of these substances, which we've discussed earlier, whatever measure is required, and you will see this outside of the EU as well. If you're in the US or out in India or Southeast Asia, that doesn't mean that you're immune from this. There's a global supply chain we're talking about here. Okay, last slide. Yeah, so thanks very much for your time. Just to mention that we're running a conference in November at Heathrow Airport, so it's very easy to fly into if you're outside of the UK, and where we're going to have covering ROS, REACH, eco-design, conflict minerals as well, and with speakers from industry, policymakers, and technical experts as well. You can check out our website to have a look at that if you're interested. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks very much, Chris. Really appreciate it. What I'm going to do next is move into a very short run-through of some of the questions raised by the REACH presentations and what we can do about it. I realize we have 5 minutes left in our call now, so we will have time for, and we will open up for the few questions in just a second. I will cover very briefly on the environmental compliance side of things, REACH, and mentioned several times by both Doug and Chris, importantly linking in there with ROHS as well. Some of the biggest questions are around which parts you're using which are currently environmentally friendly, how well that information is documented and whether there is support documentation there also, and finally, if there are problems in your supply chain, either from current environmental issues through ROHS or REACH, if there are identified compliant alternatives which could be used to replace those components. These are some of the areas that we address within the SiliconExpert tools, and we would be delighted if you would be interested to have a look at some of these more comprehensive areas. Reach out to us directly, please, and we will get in touch with you to talk through the tools and the services themselves. However, because this call is completely focused on REACH, it's very important that we open up for questions from you. So I will turn back over to Amanda and we'll take some questions.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rob. So there's only a couple questions that have come through, so I'm going to quickly run through these questions, and with whatever time we have left, we'll let Rob continue to present. So the first question was asked during Doug's presentation, and the question was, is there anywhere where there's a consolidated list of substances, both current and future, which we could audit against in our manufacturing process?
Right. Well, you have the Annex 14 list, which is substances that are on the authorization list. You then have the candidate list, which is the list of substances that will eventually go onto the authorization list in the future. And then I know Chris has comments on this before, but then you also, if you go into the appendices of the REACH registration, there were 6 appendices that covered carcinogenic substances of category 1 and 2, mutagenic of 1 and 2, and then reprotoxic of 1 and 2, which were substances that would eventually end up on the list some other time in the future. And I know Chris is probably better talking about some of the other areas where you can get some ideas, because I know he's talked about this before. Is that something you can finish off with, Chris?
Okay. There is no definitive list as such. I mean, there are a number of industry standards. Bear in mind that we're not just talking about the EU here. You're often talking about trying to satisfy a customer rather than a particular piece of legislation, though you need to satisfy the legislation at the same time. The Joint Industry Guide, JIG List 101, eventually has turned into an IEC standard. The number I cannot remember off the top of my head, but that the IEC committee that maintains that standard will add substances which are either restricted in some way or reportable in some way to that standard. There'll be some delay associated with that because standards tend to work like that, but nevertheless that's a good starting point. But you've also got to bear in mind that depending on who you're supplying, they will also have their own favourite lists, which may or may not be based on scientific evidence. They might be based on company policy or some sort of green policy as well, or maybe even pressure, so you have to be quite careful.
Great, thank you, Chris. Another question that just came in reads, any thoughts on IEC 62474 as a means of capturing multiple lists of substances, including all REACH lists?
There you go. IEC 62474, I think, was the number I was trying to think of actually. So I think it's probably the best starting point for doing this sort of thing. But it will not be up to date, and it won't obviously give you future proofing, because it doesn't cover roadmap substances, for example, which may not necessarily end up being restricted or on Annex 14, but it's quite likely that a lot of them will be. So you, in terms of obsolescence management, you really need to be looking earlier than that particular standard.
Okay, great, thank you. And to be honest with you, there's a few more questions, but they seem to be a little bit more personal. So what I'm going to do, and with the rest of the questions that I see here, I'm going to allow our speakers to individually answer these questions and follow up with you guys personally after the webinar. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and allow Rob to finish up his slides and quickly close the webinar for you guys.
Thanks very much, Amanda. And Chris and Doug, thank you very much for the educational, informative presentations today. We really appreciate being able to work with industry leaders such as yourselves to present the information to our wide customer base and to the base of people interested in what we're doing here. Very proud of what we do, and thank you very much for taking the time to present. So the last slide that we have really looks at one of our infographics which we produce. We regularly produce information to the industry to enable our users, our customers, and the industry more widely to view trends and component information. We produce infographics on varied areas like REACH, like ROHS, like counterfeits and conflict minerals, just to name a few. The one that you see in front of you is a new infographic which gives us the top 10 product lines that contain substances of very high concern. You can see at the top of the list is some of the passives, and at the bottom of the list microcontrollers and more complex components. However, please check out our SiliconExpert.com/blog for more information. All of our infographics, webinars, training seminars, and white papers are available through our website, and I strongly advise you, for educational purposes, or if it's just personal interest, to check out our blog and download that information. Again, as I mentioned before, if you would like to see a demonstration with the tools and how we can work to help mitigate the risks of obsolescence through REACH and ROHS problems in your supply chain, please let us know, and we'll be delighted to talk with you, understand your issues, and try and help you as best we can. With that, we should have been into a demo portion, but we've run a little bit over. So in that case, if you do have any questions, queries, or otherwise, please do feel free to contact us directly. If you would like to have demonstrations of our tools, please contact me personally, either on the cell phone number displayed on the screen, or the email address, or by dropping an email through our website if you're online later on and you lose my details, to ask us for questions, queries, help, or support. It's been a pleasure working with you today. Thank you for attending, and I hope to speak to a lot of you very soon.